The locker room was almost empty when the damage was discovered. The crowds had already left Oakmont. The cameras had moved on. The U.S. Open leaderboard was no longer the biggest story. Then one report changed everything. A major champion had become the center of a controversy that forced the USGA into a decision nobody wanted to make. Because this was no longer just about a bad round. It was about the reputation of one of golf's biggest championships. Wyndham Clark arrived at the U.S. Open with a story that seemed impossible to ignore. Only a few years earlier, he was searching for consistency and fighting to prove he belonged among golf's elite. Then everything changed at Los Angeles Country Club. In 2023, Clark captured his first major championship and became one of the newest faces of American golf. But with that victory came something every champion eventually discovers. The spotlight never turns off. Because winning a major does not only bring celebration, that it brings expectations. Every action is analyzed. Every decision is judged, that a player who once fought for recognition suddenly becomes someone who represents the sport itself. And when that player makes a mistake away from the leaderboard, the consequences become much bigger than one tournament. That is exactly what happened after Oakmont. The U.S. Open has always been different from every other championship in golf. IT is not designed to reward comfort. It is designed to expose weakness. The rough is brutal. The greens are unforgiving. The pressure is unlike anything players experience during a normal week. Some of the greatest golfers in history have walked away from a U.S. Open frustrated and defeated. But there is one expectation that has always remained. Control yourself. For generations, golf has built its identity around respect. Respect for opponents. Respect for the course. Respect for the traditions that make the game unique. Players can be emotional. They can be disappointed. They can struggle. But how they respond in those moments often becomes part of their legacy. And that is why the Wyndham Clark situation created such a strong reaction. The controversy was not simply about frustration after a difficult tournament. IT was about what happens when emotions cross a line. Reports surrounding the Oakmont incident quickly spread throughout the golf world. Fans, analysts, and officials began asking the same question. How should the sport respond when one of its champions makes a mistake? For the USGA, there was no easy answer. The organization found itself trapped between two difficult choices. Ignore the situation, and critics would say the standards of the championship were being weakened. Respond too strongly, and others would argue that a player was being punished forever for one emotional moment. Either way, the decision would create controversy, because the USGA was not only dealing with Wyndham Clark, it was protecting the image of the U.S. Open. Every year, the championship tells the world that it represents the toughest test in golf. IT celebrates players who can handle impossible pressure and remain composed when everything starts falling apart. The champion is not only the person with the lowest score. The champion is supposed to represent the values of the event. That made the situation different. A normal mistake disappears after a few days. That a missed putt becomes history. That a bad round becomes a statistic. But when the conversation moves from performance to behavior, the story changes completely. Suddenly, the question is no longer, how did he play? The question becomes, what does this say about the player? And that is a much harder question to answer. Some fans believe Clark deserved understanding. They pointed out that professional golfers deal with enormous pressure that most people never experience. One tournament can change rankings, sponsorships, and an entire career. They believe mistakes should not erase everything Clark had accomplished. Others saw it differently. They believe winning a major championship comes with responsibility. A U.S. Open champion becomes part of golf history. Young players watch them. Fans follow them. Sponsors attach their names to them. With that level of success comes a higher standard. And somewhere between those two arguments was the impossible position of the USGA. Because officials were not deciding whether Wyndham Clark was a good person or a bad person. They were deciding how a championship built on tradition should handle a moment that challenged those traditions. They had to consider fairness, accountability, and the future message it would send. Behind the scenes, the situation became a much bigger conversation about modern golf. Today's players live in a completely different world. Every reaction can be recorded. Every mistake can go viral within minutes. Social media turns private moments into public debates before anyone has time to understand the full story. The pressure surrounding elite athletes has never been higher. But at the same time, The expectations have never been clearer. The biggest stars in golf are not only judged by trophies, they are judged by how they handle adversity. That is why Wyndham Clark's response became such an important part of the story. The controversy created one moment, but what happened afterward would determine whether that moment became a permanent stain or simply a difficult chapter in his career. Because history has shown that athletes are often remembered less for the mistake itself and more for what they do after it. Some never recover. Others use the moment as a turning point. And for Clark, the next decision would matter more than the first one, because the USGA's biggest challenge was still waiting. How do you hold a champion accountable without destroying his path back? How do you protect the traditions of the game while allowing room for redemption? And most importantly, how does the organization make a decision when every possible option creates another controversy? That was the problem sitting in front of the USGA. And the next move will reveal exactly how golf's governing body planned to handle one of its most difficult moments in recent memory. The hardest part for the USGA was never deciding whether the incident mattered. Everyone understood that actions inside a championship venue carry consequences. The real challenge was deciding what those consequences should look like. Because every choice would send a message about the future standards of professional golf, and every decision would be judged by players, fans, and officials around the world. The USGA has always protected one thing above everything else: the reputation of the championship. For more than a century, the U.S. Open has been built on difficulty, discipline, and respect. The winners are remembered not only because they played better than everyone else. They are remembered because they survived moments when pressure became almost impossible to handle. That is what separates the U.S. Open from ordinary tournaments. And that is why the Wyndham Clark situation became such a complicated issue. Because the USGA was dealing with a champion, a player who had already created one of the most emotional moments in recent golf history, that a player who represented the new generation of stars, the player whose journey from uncertainty to major champion inspired thousands of young golfers. Officials had to consider the complete picture, not just one mistake, not just one moment, but the responsibility that comes with wearing the title of U.S. Open champion. That is where the debate around accountability became so intense. Many believe the situation required a strong response. They argue that professional athletes understand the consequences of their actions. If a player represents one of golf's greatest championships, they must also represent the values behind it. Without accountability, critics fear the standards of the sport could slowly disappear. But another group saw the situation through a different lens. They believed mistakes should not define an entire career. They believed athletes should be given the opportunity to learn, apologize, and improve. After all, golf itself is built around recovery that a player can hit a terrible shot and still find a way back. The question was whether the same principle should apply outside the ropes. That question created a much larger conversation about modern athletes. Today, players are not only competitors. They are brands. They are public figures. They are representatives of the organizations and championships they participate in. Every interview, every reaction, every mistake can influence how fans view the sport. And that pressure has changed the way athletes handle difficult moments. Years ago, controversies could disappear after a few days. Today, they live forever online. A single moment can be replayed thousands of times. Opinions can spread instantly that a player's reputation can change before the full story is even understood. That reality makes leadership decisions more complicated than ever. The USGA had to consider not only what happened at Oakmont, it had to consider what message its response would create. Would the decision show that championship standards still matter? Or would it show that golf understands human mistakes and allows athletes to rebuild? There was no perfect answer. And that is exactly why situations like this are so difficult. Because sports organizations are not only protecting rules, they are protecting culture. The culture of competition, the culture of respect, the culture that connects today's players with the legends who came before them. For Wyndham Clark, the path forward depended on more than one apology. Words can change public opinion for a moment, but actions change reputation over time. History has shown this repeatedly. Some athletes make mistakes and allow those moments to define them. Others respond by changing the way people see them. The difference is consistency. It is what happens after the cameras leave. It is how a player behaves when nobody is watching. And that became the biggest challenge for Clark. Could he turn one of the most difficult moments of his career into a lesson? Could he rebuild trust with fans who felt disappointed? Could he show that the person responsible for the mistake was not the same person moving forward? Those questions would not be answered by one statement. They would be answered over months and years. Because in professional sports, redemption is never given instantly. It is earned. And while the controversy created uncomfortable headlines, it also revealed something important about golf itself. The sport still cares deeply about character. In an era where money, technology, and business decisions dominate conversations, moments like this remind fans why tradition still matters. Golf has always been about more than scorecards. IT has always been about how players handle pressure, failure, and difficult moments. That is why the Wyndham Clark situation became bigger than one locker room. It became a conversation about what modern golf expects from its champions. Should greatness only be measured by trophies? Or should the way someone responds to adversity matter just as much? That question will continue following athletes across every sport. Because winning creates fame. But character determines legacy. For the USGA, the situation represented a difficult balancing act. The organization had to protect the values of the U.S. Open while recognizing that every athlete has moments they wish they could change. For Wyndham Clark, the challenge became even more personal. He had already proven he could win golf's biggest tournaments. Now, he had to prove something different. That he could handle the moments after the victory. That he could accept criticism. That he could learn. And that one mistake would not become the final chapter of his story. Because championships create legends. But how players respond when things go wrong often determines whether those legends last. The USGA faced a decision with no perfect solution. Wyndham Clark faced a moment that tested more than his golf game, and the entire situation revealed one truth about professional sports. The hardest battles are not always played on the course. Sometimes they happen after the final shot has already been hit. So now the question goes to you. Do you believe the USGA handled the situation correctly, or should championship officials have taken stronger action? Should athletes receive a path toward redemption, or do major champions carry a higher responsibility from the moment they win? Let us know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed documentary-style golf stories exploring the biggest moments, controversies, and decisions shaping the sport, subscribe for more deep breakdowns.